Previous class, we talked about header compression, HPACK header, and then we said, okay, fine. There are primarily speaking two different types of tables available: static table and dynamic table. So in static table, we have common headers such as authority, method. Methods can be of different types: get, post, lead, head, etc., etc. And then we have the path. Uh, then we have scheme. Then we have statuses. Statuses can also be of different types. And if we are sending a request and something is not from the static header, for that uh, we have to build we have to build a dynamic table for the lifetime of the connection. For example, if we have a new authority, obviously the website that we are trying to access, which is not there in the static table, for that we need to maintain a dynamic table. And then if we have a new path, for example, for that also we need to maintain a this we need to make an entry into this dynamic table. Okay, so what we want to enter in the dynamic table and what we don't want to, this can be distinguished based on the HVAC encoded headers frame, right? So, for example, if we have uh, if we have any value between uh, 802 FF, right? So this means this is an already indexed value. I mean, this represents a static table. If we have starting with 40 or 41, I'm talking about the hexadecimal value. This means that this is something new that we want to add into the table. And then again, we can make a decision that the literal header field with indexing um can be, allowed to index or will never be allowed to index. इससे क्या मना आता है? Let me give you an example. We'll try to build on top of it. Okay. So आवाज आ रही है आपको? So for example, let me have a typical HTTP2 example. Say I want to send a simple HTTP request. Obviously, this is HTTP2 request. Okay. So this is the request in text. Okay. For example, I want to get a page. For that, I need a method, and the method is get. Then next is the path. Uh, path is index.html. Then we have scheme, and say scheme is HTTPS. We'll talk about this in today's class. Um, then we have authority. Authority means the website that we want to access. Say authority is example.com, and then we have user agent. Say I have any user agent. For example, I have some my own custom built user agent. Okay, right? And what I'll be doing is, just for the sake of example, I will, for for this specific entry, right? User agent, I will be showing it in with three different indexing types. Okay, just for the academic purposes, just to represent what are the different indexing types. Okay, so excuse me. So this will be shown with three three different indexing types. Okay, so that we can cover our discussion on uh, different types of indexing. Okay, indexing types. This is usually not the case, but just for the sake of example, so we just want to cover different types of indexing. So this is my request in text. Okay, obviously we know that whenever we need to send the request in HTTP2, this has to be converted into a corresponding HPACK encoded headers frame. So let's say corresponding. This is the corresponding HPACK encoded headers frame. Okay, right. So for example, my encoded HPACK headers frame is 82, 86, 84, right? So this represents what? Um, this represents a get, okay? Say this represents the scheme, which is HTTPS, okay? This represents index.html path, which is very common and is always there in our static table, okay? And now I need to, I need to provide uh, the authority. And this is something new, right? This is a new website that I would want to visit, and obviously is not part of the static table. So this is the entry that I need to make in the dynamic table, right? And so for that I'll write here 41, right? 41 off, and the remaining hexadecimal values will represent uh, the authority. Okay, for example, I need to use 1 byte to represent E, X, A, M, P, L, and so on and so forth. Okay, so from then the remaining bytes here, for example, right up to this represents what? This represents the entry that I want to make in the dynamic table for this authority. Okay, and then this goes on. So this means what? This represents this part of the corresponding HPAC encoded header frame represents what? Index name plus the literal value which is incrementally indexed. Okay, so this represents what? So ये तो हमें पता चल गया कि ये क्या represent करता है. This all represents what? Okay, static table indexing. Yes, no. Sorry. So this represents static table entries, okay, which are already there, and this is something new that I want to make. I want to enter into the dynamic table. So this I can represent as uh, index name, indexed name. So I also need to make this entry of authority, right, which is the index name. Plus it will have a literal value. Okay, literal value will be added in the dynamic table incrementally, right? So if this is the first, for example, index or value, so maybe it is represented as 61. What is the equivalent of whatever is the equivalent of 41 or so on and so forth, right? Okay. So then we have so obviously this literal value uh, is incrementally uh, indexed. So it has incremental indexing. Okay. Am I done? No, right? So I still need to. So what I have done is I have in my, HBAC header, I have represented method, I have represented path, I have represented scheme, I have made a new entry in the dynamic table, okay, for this. But I also need to talk about the user agent. Or remember, I wrote here that I'll be using three separate indexing types just for the sake of representation. This is not the case, in actual request. So let me represent the user agent now. Okay, so for the user agent, I'm say using. I will, make an entry in the dynamic table for this user agent, right? And for that, I'm using 40. Okay, and then say 0a, this represents the length of the literal header field, right? And then this will be followed by the values. Okay, so, okay, so now this is a literal header field with incremental indexing, right? This is again what? This was the literal header field name with value 41, and 40 means what? 40 means uh, literal headers field with incremental indexing. Okay, so both are used to make an entry in the table, right? Incrementally with incremental indexing. So what is the difference between this 41 and 40 and 41? So I'll leave it with a question mark. We'll see in a minute. आप भी जरा इस पे think about it, right? And then for the same, you know, for the same user agent, I have another entry. Okay. Remember, we said we will be using three different indexing types for this, user agent. So, for example, I have 10. Okay. Then I have again the length 0a. Okay. And the value representing this, user agent. Okay. Okay. So now this represents what? This represents literal header with field never indexed, right? Literal header field, and this is 10 tells us that this should not be indexed, whatever is the condition, right? Never indexed. Okay, and similarly, I can have another representation for the user agent with 00, again the length, the same value, and the bytes representing my user agent value. Okay, 38 to E30. Okay, now this 00 represents what? This 00 represents um, again it's a literal header field without indexing. Okay, so uh, literal header field without indexing. Okay, so now we have three types. We have 8 to, right, or we have value which starts from 8. Okay, 8, then it has a range of, as we have shown here, from 8 to 80 to ff, right? And then um, 80 to ff, and then we have when I say 80, this means this value is always on, right? And then we can have any values there. Okay, right? And when I say 41 or 40, and then this means that this bit is always on. Okay, and then we have this range. Similarly, when I say 1 0, this means this bit is always on. Okay, and when I say 0 0, so this means this 0 represents, right, that this is something that we don't want to remember. Okay, can be indexed if required, but don't want to remember. And in this, 40, or the HPAC header starting with 4. Okay, we have two possibilities. Either we can have 4 1, or we can have 4 0. Okay, so whenever we have in the HPAC 40, this means this is true for almost every new custom header on the first occurrence, right? So whenever we are making a new request to our server in our connection, right? So we always have this 40, right? The 40 is about is almost every new connection, every new header, custom header on first occurrence. Whenever we have a first occurrence and then we want to send a custom header, maybe that includes a new user agent or something, right? Maybe uh, a new user agent, or maybe a new authority or something, right? So we need to use this for 0. Okay, so this can represent, this is true for user agent. Okay, this can represent cookies. We'll talk about cookies maybe in the next class. uh, Cookies on first first request. Okay, and this may represent some custom APIs. Okay, or some custom headers. Okay, so for example, X headers. X means Twitter. Okay, so whenever we have a first interaction with the server and we are making you know want to make an entry for the new user agent, or for the cookies for that matter, so we always use 40 in the you know this HPAC encoded header string, right? So when do we use 41 then? So 41, in 41, this is a common header name that already exists in these, in the table, right? Okay, but it has a new value. Okay, for example, so 41 is a common header, common header name that already exists. Okay, in the table, but has a new value. For example, um, authority. So authority is already there in the static table. Yes, no, but we have a new value every time. For example, we want to make a request. Okay, so authority, this can represent, for example, what type of language do you want to accept. This can represent cache control, cache dash control. We'll see. We'll also talk about this later in I think in the next class, maybe. Uh, Maybe encoding type. Okay, except encoding. Okay, so these values are already there in the static table, right? So let me add static in the static table, right? These values are already there in the static table. So 41 represents the common header uh, name that already exists in the static table such as this, but with a new value, right? With a new value. Okay, right. So, so if we want to make a new entry which is not there in the common headers, static headers, right? So for that we use what? Party. But if we have already these headers there in the static table, but there is a new value against this header, so for that we use what you want to make literal, indexing in the dynamic table. Okay. For example, if just to give you an example on this, right? So, for example, I have a new user agent, anything, right? So maybe my new user agent is my very custom, bot. Okay, it has some version, and let's say it's experimental. So this is the new user agent, right? So first time when I send an HTTP request, I will use what? 40, right? To make this new entry of user agent into you know the dynamic table. Okay, this will followed by the length of all, the length of this field, and the bytes representing the alphabets, say U, S, E, R, etc., etc., right? And then it will be followed by, say, again, uh, length of the value. This is again the length. This is actual value, and this value represents what? User agent. This is again the length, right? Okay, and then this is the value. Okay, which represents this actual value. Okay, so this is the very first time I'm sending this request in a connection to a browse server. I will use 40, but for the next request, HTTP request, I'll use what? I'll use 4.1 because this is already there. Okay, so the next request, so will be used on no, used for next request on the same connection. Okay, are you getting it? Right. So if I go back, so then we are left with you know um, 10 and 00. So if it is a 10, so this means 10 means that uh, this value will never be indexed, right? This value will be never indexed. Maybe it contains, sorry, maybe it contains some cookies, okay, that I don't want to be recorded by the intermediaries, right? The intermediate devices, for example, the proxy servers, for example, the CDNs. Don't want them to record anything, right? Anything with the value starting with 10, and this usually represents what? The cookies or the sensitive information that I don't want to be recorded. Okay, so if I don't want a value to be recorded in a header, I will always start this with 10. So it's again a literal header field which is never indexed, which is sent as it is. Okay, so every time I send a request, this value, if it is representing, for example, a cookie, will always be sent as it is. Okay, it will be never indexed. This is an instruction for the intermediate, hops that you hops that you do not need to uh, make an index of this value. And similarly, if I representing something in my header starting with 00, so this means again, this is a literal header field. It will not be indexed, right? Without indexing, but there is no compulsion. Without indexing means that I'm not making an entry in the dynamic table, okay? But if any intermediate device, for example, proxy servers, for example, CDNs, they want to make an index, they can make an index, right? So this does not contain sensitive information such as cookies, right, and session information and other things, right? So if any intermediate device wants to make an entry in the dynamic table, the device can be, it is allowed, right? Whereas um, in this literal header, starting with 10, this is never allowed. Okay, so this is for the security purposes. The critical information in our request that we don't want to be indexed, or that can be used for crime, right? Uh, Making certain, attacks, to the client, to the server, right? So what we do basically is we use 10, and what is true for the both 10 and 00, these value will not be indexed, right? It will be sent as it is, as far as the sender is concerned, as a literal header field.